Welcome to Let's Talk. Our session today is titled Using Data Effectively, the Findings from a QRIS Data Community of Practice. I'm Debbie Mathias from the BUILD Initiative and the Director of the QRIS National Learning Network. Before we begin our session, I'd like to thank the Alliance for Early Success and other generous funders for making this learning community possible. We began this series for state quality administrators and leaders to support their essential work within states around early learning systems building. Quality administrators are welcome to invite other participants as related to the specific topic of the call. We know several of you invited colleagues interested in data, research, QRIS implementation, and other partners. We have colleagues on this call from over 28 states and territories. We intentionally keep the sessions small to invite conversation and sharing. We hope these calls enable us to illuminate challenges, innovation, and promising practices. After the session, a survey will pop up asking for your suggestions, comments, or questions. We appreciate your input and ideas about the session, and we'll follow up with resources as requested. In fact, there will be a paper that you'll hear more about today attached to this session. We're very excited to be releasing this paper today. Also, thinking ahead, let me know if you're working on a promising practice or facing a challenge in your state system building. Send me an email, and we can develop a Let's Talk discussion around the topic. Make sure to keep track of your ideas, questions, and examples for our talks throughout the webinar. Enter them in the chat box so we can discuss. Although data-informed collaborative interactions lay the foundation of QRIS, the skills and strategies needed to use data effectively and can be easily underdeveloped or overlooked. In this session of Let's Talk, participants from our own BUILD Initiative Data Community of Practice will discuss approaches to increasing data capacity, literacy, and impact within the QRIS. And as I mentioned before, a guidebook will be sent out after the session. Thank you for taking the time to answer the questions when you registered. Many of you provided thoughtful ideas. We reviewed the information that's informing the presentation. Many of you in the sign-up were most interested in hearing about how other states are using data, how to use data for CQI, examples of appropriate metrics, and how to use the data we've collected most effectively at many levels of the system, the state, county, meanwhile being mindful to talk with programs about how to use data at the individual child level, classroom level, site and agency level to guide practice and decision making. Some of the approaches you mentioned to collecting and using data included use of online state systems integrated to support workforce, professional development that informs the scoring of the QRIS rating levels, and also using data to inform practice and increase accountability. A few of the critical skills and competencies you identified for use with data are knowing what the data mean and how to use it, understanding what data to collect, and informing users and participants what and how to use the data. An eye for detail and the small detail, as well as understanding and seeing the big picture at the same time. And many of you mentioned that a shared understanding of the data and data sources within the state or region was really important, a working knowledge of how to use reports. Well, without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have Nick Gillian. He is the Manager for Preparation Program Effectiveness with Washington State Professional Educator Standards Board and a consultant with Johns Hopkins University. Mary Payson is a consultant focused on data systems, workforce technical assistance standards, grants for infrastructure and data literacy, data governance, and e-learning content development. Last but not least, Chris Swanson leads a team at Johns Hopkins University focused on improving outcomes for young children. So wanting to get these folks started because they have so much interesting information to share and to get your feedback about, I'd like to turn it over to Nick.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad you could join us. I'm truly grateful that we have this opportunity. Thank you, Debbie and Bill and Jonathan, for helping pull this together. I think I speak for all three of us when I communicate the excitement with which we were able to develop and create and now release this data resource. I want to just provide an opportunity to introduce myself and Mary and Chris to do the same, oriented around the 3 questions: what do you do? How do you come to this work in data? And what do you see as a benefit of this resource? So I'm going to put those 3 out there. What I do right now is I work with higher education programs. Those are colleges and universities who are preparing educators in the state of Washington, and working with them on developing a new system for collecting annual data and using that to make program and system level conclusions and decisions and changes. And prior to that, I've done work in the QRIS system in Washington. And across both of these is something I've come to realize about data that brings me to this work. I provide a little analogy here. You may have taken some music lessons in your life. Imagine piano lessons. If you can imagine taking piano lessons from someone who picked up the piano very naturally, didn't have to try, work, or struggle with it. Learning piano from that person is fantastic if you also pick it up naturally. The problem is if you don't, it can be really difficult to learn from someone for whom it has come so easily. And I make that analogy because I think the same is true around data and data use. There are those of us for whom the numbers and information that they represent comes very easily. It's easy to look at a graphic and make clear sense of it, look at a spreadsheet, have a problem of practice and assign variables and analyze those variables. For others of us, it makes less sense, and it is more difficult to do. And so it leads to this idea that in order to create an opportunity for folks at all levels of the system to use data effectively, it's increasingly important that we know how to break down not only what the data mean, but our approaches to making these conclusions. And I'll underscore that point just by mentioning that in doing some analysis of our early learning providers in Washington State and the types of courses they've taken in college, I noted that most folks don't have a lot of math in their background. Further, many of the folks working in QRIS policy systems have moved their way up from practice or directorship in some way, and maybe or probably didn't take on a lot of extra math classes in that way. So we have a system that is built upon using and understanding data that sometimes is staffed from the bottom to the top with folks for whom that may not come naturally. And that's really what was the driving influence of creating something simple and user-friendly and engaging like this guidebook. And so that's what brings me here today. And I'm really excited also to introduce a colleague, Mary Payson. And Mary, if you just tell us what you do and what brings you to this work in data and why you're excited about this opportunity to share the resource.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. What brings me to this work in data is a long and winding road. I started as a preschool teacher in Connecticut. From there, I got interested in family work because I saw that children needed strong families to help them in the early years of life. So I became a social worker, got an MSW, started working with children and families, or children suspected of maltreatment. From there, I really quickly thought, oh gosh, if I could just kind of work with groups of families and use my efforts to affect changes to groups, that would be good. So I got an MPA, public administration degree, and the combination of social worker and MPA allowed me to join University of South Carolina as a researcher. So I was a researcher on 2 projects, one of them very highly related to early childhood. And then from there, we knew that our research processes needed data for helping people make better decisions about serving young children. So from the researcher job at USC, I became a data warehouse, I'm not a data guru, but I became a data worker. And I spent 10 years in a data warehouse working on the statewide early childhood program in South Carolina called First Steps, which was a privilege because I got to help them pretty much at the beginning develop a very comprehensive data system, and First Steps developed its programs and its processes and its policies, and I helped them develop right along with it using data. I went from there to North Carolina Smart Start and worked on a Race to the Top funded data project, and that project had a lot of components. It had data development, it had outcomes metrics, it had e-learning, it also had mini grants and funding local projects for data capacity building. So from that, I would say right now I am a data project capacity builder, consultant, working with some Head Start stuff and kind of doing a number of things. And I will say I am not math phobic, but I'm not a math person, and I like statistics. And I've gotten to the point in my life where I cannot help my children who are middle school and high school age with their math any longer, but my high schooler helps her younger sister. So I will say I come to this really as a preschool teacher, social worker, and got into the data work in a very kind of a funny and but a natural way. And so I'm not an analyst, and that helps me be a good bridge between the data and the analytical work and the programs. So I'll say that I'm kind of a bridge person, and that's me. And on to Chris.
Great. Thank you, Mary and Nick and Debbie for the introduction. And hello out there. I'm Chris Swanson, and I am the Senior Director for Quality Care and Education with the Johns Hopkins Center for Technology and Education. And what that really entails is I get the privilege of working with a talented team of folks both at Johns Hopkins and with many of our partners in different state agencies, including here in Maryland, in focusing on improving the quality of care and early learning for all kids, making sure that high-quality early learning experiences are accessible for every child, regardless of their geographic location, their socioeconomic status, or their developmental trajectory. The work that we do encompasses not only QRIS, where Johns Hopkins is a partner with the state of Maryland in operating that, but also focused on promoting school readiness, and I like to take a very broad definition of that term, in helping to improve the competency and abilities of staff, and doing so in a way that is sustainable from a financial standpoint, but also contributory to the quality improvements that we all seek to make, and ultimately finding kind of new and novel ways to cut through the clutter to communicate that to all the different stakeholders, from families and funders and policymakers and providers and directors and every single person for whom the importance of quality early learning and care matters. Ironically, which I know for some of you may be thinking, well, got Mary who doesn't like math, and I'm about to say that I too, despite my faculty pedigree, don't necessarily love the mathematics behind data. What really gets me going is the story, and I come to this work as an English major and a high school English teacher originally in public schools that constantly looked for the earlier level to intervene that really made a difference for kids, and worked my way from middle school then down to elementary school and into child care and early education programs at all different levels from teacher to administrator. And for me, the numbers and the sort of aggregate of data is less important than the story that is told and kind of the human interest side behind that of what is happening in the life of a child, what is happening in the learning and skill development of our staff, and what can we do as a system to promote that. And that is really where I get excited about data, because I think it allows us to talk across systems, across initiatives, across projects, and really look at an early learning systems approach. And I'm hopeful that, as Nick said, this guide will be a support to all of you in making those same connections. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking with you this afternoon. All right, Nick, back to you.
Thanks, and if you could advance the slide, please, we'd be ready to move on. Okay, so using data effectively. As you heard us describe, none of us are data or math wizards, which puts us in a great position to find ways to make this use of data effective at all levels and by all those who are involved in QRIS systems. And so we had this notion to create a user guide that would help identify some effective strategies and practices that could be used in QRIS, not just by system administrators, not just by the data folks who run them or the research teams, but really to create a guide that could be used in many different ways by many different people within the policy system. So as a practical guide, it doesn't delve too deeply into numbers, statistics, or database language. I'm excited that there are more and more resources out there that do that. I'm excited to see work on integrated early childhood data systems and the ways in which those can be set up. And I absolutely think system administrators need to pay careful attention to how those are developing and proliferating. And for thinking about providers in the field or the coaches who work with them, that information is not really at the correct grain size or scope to be immediately useful. So we wanted to create something that would fill that gap. And this practical user guide is something that does that. And so I'll give you a little intro to what this guide is and does. So in it, there are links to articles and training documents. So we have live links in the text that take you to agenda templates that can help with data exploration with teams, activities that one can use with providers, with coaches in onboarding trainings, et cetera, in order to ground the information in practice. And you can also interact with this guide by clicking on various links within it that not only take you outside of the guide to different resources and curated content, but also help you skip around within the guide. So although this can be read in less than an hour cover to cover, it's also something that can be picked up as a resource if you hit some data-related problem or if another staff person that you work with does. So with that, I want to make the point that this isn't just useful to those in the higher levels of system administration, but really something that we want to make sure you folks encourage others within the system to use, including the supervisors of coaching staff, technical assistants, even in the case of working with providers. Because ultimately, QRIS are opportunities to use data effectively, whether that's a parent recognizing the value of high-quality child care by being informed that even there are ratings, or by a provider who receives ratings and feedback and then makes decisions about how to change his or her practice. So this guide provides an opportunity for folks across the policy system to use and interact with it in a really interesting way. So beyond what the guide is, I want to just talk a little bit about how we made it, and Mary will go into greater detail about that. But it wasn't something that Chris and Mary and I sat down and thought about and did, but rather what we did was convene people who were asking these kinds of questions. We got together with people who were interested in this kind of information, and over the course of a year, we met regularly to gather information. And as I look at the list of those who are joining us on this call, I recognize several names. And so I want to acknowledge and appreciate those of you who did join in that community of practice across the year. And as Mary is describing how it went, I do invite you to share your own feedback. Beyond the use of data and the content of this, I think the method we used to actually build this guide could be replicated in a variety of different topic areas. So that's just a bit about the guide, but I want to just provide a little bit more in terms of high-level overview before Mary describes how we made it. So I've mentioned that it's practical. I've mentioned that it's at a grain size that can be useful, but I really want to talk about three aspects that were vital in the creating of this, and one of them is data literacy. So thinking about literacy and the idea that we can code, encode, and decode information to make it meaningful. That's really what we're talking about. Literacy is also about making something legible, making it useful and able to be picked up and used. And so again, that's a big piece of using this guide. We think by applying these strategies and practices, you can make something that wasn't legible to a wider variety of people, all of whom need it. Data capacity. We're talking a little bit about the hardware and software, and I think that, again, is something for the IT administrators and systems administrators to really grapple with about what kinds of data infrastructure are needed. But if you think about our coaching staffs who are out there in the field, they're interacting with these interfaces. They're actually inputting the data, and the quality of the data that they put in is extremely important. So not only the system capacity, but the person capacity, the human capacity of being able to collect and use quality field notes is something that this guide can really help us do. Also taking the aggregated data from across systems and turning that into meaningful graphics is something that we address in here, and that relates to our capacity to be able to make what we're doing legible. And further, we're talking about data impact. So we want that the information collected can be read and then used in order to make an impact. And we want that the impact that QRIS makes through all the work that's going on in the field, that impact can be collected through strong data capacity and literacy. So those are really the three aspects that we pick up in this work. Can we advance to using the guide? Next slide. So again, practices and strategies, accessible concepts, links to articles, and case examples to ground the information. The case examples we drew from our work with the group. So individuals who participated would in some cases say, this is something that we do well, we'd like to tell you about it. And in some cases they would say, we are stuck here, and this is what we need help with. And as I'm sure a lot of you can relate to who have participated in talks like this, it can be a situation where we want to represent ourselves and our states and our systems very well, and we're a little bit reticent to say this is something that we are screwing up, or this is something that we are stuck on and we don't know what to do about it. We created a community of practice where that was really encouraged, and we ended up having a lot of participation to that effect, where folks would say this is something that we're stuck on, and it's something we would like to get some more information about. And that was something that really happened, and we used case examples to ground that information. When we share the case examples in the story or in this guidebook, we depersonalized, we de-identified. So the idea being we're not unique in the challenges we face. A lot of us are dealing with the same issues, and then we can collectively share and explore them. We put ourselves in a stronger position to make moves to make improvements. And with that, I want to turn it over to Mary to talk a little bit more about our community of practice. So can we advance slides, please? And so I did describe this already, but before we have Mary, I'll just mention that it's really important to think about. I mentioned, yes, some folks are really strong with data use. They know what to do with it. They're savvy with it. But actually everybody has a data-related role. If you think about this, from the parent to the provider to the field staff to the systems administrators, everyone has actually a role and responsibility to use data effectively. And so we want to be able to integrate those strategies into practice. Okay, we can advance. All right, so Mary, we talked to the group just a little bit about how it was that we pulled this group together and what it was like to be part of this group. You were one that joined with participation real early on and was really instrumental to the success that this has become. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that went?
Oh, I will. Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I was the first presenter for the data community practice, and Nick was very really helpful in helping me kind of shape what really was a data story. As Chris mentioned, I made a good attempt at explaining the data project I was on in North Carolina at Smart Start, and definitely storytelling skills came into play with that because as we all know, data is such a broad topic, and we do need some good storytelling abilities. So Nick helped me shape some parts of my story, which was pretty vast because it was a 4-year project. At any rate, I was really gratified to be invited to the community practice. I was gratified to participate all year, and I was one of 40 different participants we had in that year. And I gave the first presentation, and I had a chance to participate in all of the discussions. And it says here on the slide our average group size was 12, and we had a really ultimate number of participants on the call. On each call, it seemed, because we were all able to really have a discussion, to ask questions, to provide feedback. It seemed like it was a nice size. And the timing was good as well, and Nick and Debbie helped really structure us. So we had a nice time frame of 90 minutes. We did 9 of these meetings over the year. We didn't meet in the summer. And the themes of the meetings were really the first one was introducing the model and introducing some concepts and starting to talk about some case examples in that model. For five of the presentations, we talked about things that were working well, and we also talked about challenges, and we brainstormed solutions. That kind of occurred across all of our talks, but people who were sharing their experiences had wonderful solutions, and also some challenges, of course, were brought up across all. And we, out of all of those, we were able, because we recorded the sessions, we were able to look back and compile strategies and practices and really pull from our very, very rich information across these 9 sessions to create the guide. I think of the data community of practice as a hive mind. We are really, really fortunate that we weird data people have a community like this. We know things about data. We know that data is not a 4-letter word. We know that data doesn't happen in that way that you see on TV, where they just click on their keyboard and things just magically happen. We know getting to utilization of data is not auto-magic, if you will, that utilization of data sometimes is the endpoint we want to get to, and it's a lot of work to actually get your data system kind of firing on all 8 cylinders. And it's wonderful to have colleagues across the nation in different states and in different programs all focused on the same kind of thing, because we are not your typical people. I think we're great bridgers. We're great interpreters of information. We are storytellers, or in this, I want to say in this community practice, I think we are going to become even better storytellers. And this summer, Chris and Nick and I presented at the QRIS Build meeting, and the topic I talked about was data storytelling. So I'm really gratified to have built my skills in this community practice. And speaking of skills, I think it's wonderful that we in a community practice are using technology in this way. We have really excellent technology for webinars. We're able to record. We are able to have interactive resources in our guide. Our guide is electronic as well as printable, so it is a place where you can dig in and get even more rich information. So I just want to say, I think I don't know if we're cutting edge on using technology, but I think we're doing really pretty well. And I'll say my challenge is telling the story and also using technology, and I feel like I've come a long way because I was not a very great webinar user in the beginning. So I will say I've grown a lot in the community practice, and the community practice has really grown in its mission. And that's all I want to talk about for right now, but later on I'll kind of circle back to some themes and ideas.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate that. Anybody on the line who had an opportunity to participate in the community of practice, and even just one session or maybe multiple sessions, would you mind speaking up, raise your hand, unmute yourself, and let us know what it was that was interesting to you about this experience? I see a hand raised. I'm going to ask. Yeah,
Linda,
go ahead if we can get.
It's *7 to unmute.
Hi, this is Lynn Rhodes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this was my first year actually in this role, and one of the things that was nice for me to find out was where other states were in looking at data, using data, and how they were using data.
It's interesting that you're saying that, because really in the pre-registration questions that came through as an interest loud and clear, people wanting to know how other states are doing this work, what they're learning, how can we share across states what we're learning. And so your point is just so germane to what I've seen across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. It was great to have your help there. Anybody else who had the opportunity to join in? Or Lynn, do you have anything else you want to add? Okay, great. Maybe we move on. Can we switch slides, please? Great. I want to provide a little bit of a high-level overview, kind of a teaser of the content, so that when you see this come across your email, you'll be sure to download it, use it, forward it, and share it with the people who you think it might be meaningful to. So here's an image of a data ecosystem. This was something that I drew as a model. I did not draw the picture, but drew the model together as from our last QRIS build meeting, the national meeting in 2016. Had some conversation about the QRIS ecosystem, and that really got me thinking about this notion of an ecosystem. And so in a simple form, ecosystems have non-living producers, consumers, and decomposers. It's a way to think about the different entities and organisms within an ecosystem, and it's really useful for making the point that everybody within a QRIS system has a data-related role, and a way that the data systems are used, but also that folks are producing data through their very activities, and folks are consuming data across the system. And then there are those analyzing and decomposing and using the data, and that is something really important to focus on, because if everybody is in some way, then everybody has some responsibility to become more literate in terms of data. And this guide tries to provide what I think has been missing, which is in a way a floor for what are the minimum things a person needs to know, do, and understand related to data use. And I hope that system administrators kind of orient around some of these concepts and even further them to find ways to use data effectively among the various service organizations and field staff members and technical assistants, et cetera. Okay, can we go right ahead? Everybody's got a data-related role, and key is that ecosystems improve through cooperative interaction. If we have some who are thinking, oh, this is not my job, it's going to break down that overall data ecosystem, and it limits the intersections and interactions of those roles. And so I know there might be a predilection to think about, oh, when we're talking about data, we're talking about who's just going to make the dashboard. But really we're talking about who's going to use the dashboard and how. And it's not enough really to think about how do we make an integrated early childhood data system at the system level if those who could use the information don't know it exists, how to access it, or how to use it effectively. So those are key considerations that this guide tries to address. All right, we can go ahead. We had the opportunity to have a lot of training sessions about the use of data and with field staff members in my experience, and we would start that activity by asking folks to define what is data, or in the sense that is a plural word, right? So what are data? And we would get these various kinds of pieces of information, and they revealed both a common definition that we were able to orient around and several problematic assumptions. In terms of common definition, information gathered and used on purpose seem to be the most useful and effective way to think about it. So much like the ecosystem analogy tries to create an access point for those who might be data phobic. A simple definition that goes information gathered and used on purpose also creates accessibility to even the concept of data and data use. So it's nice to orient around something as simple and accessible as that. Beyond that common definition, we revealed some problematic assumptions when we would get these various definitions from our participants. Data are numbers. There was less recognition of the qualitative data that really are critical if we're talking about field notes for states who are using on-site technical assistance and coaching. Learning how to do field notes, sometimes that training really just involves here's what you click, here's where you type, but not what you're looking at, how you're describing it, and how you're seeing it. And so in the guide, there are some great user-friendly resources that could be used in trainings or could be used, in fact, we did use in trainings or could be used in orientations or team meetings. Another problematic assumption, data are objective or they're true. What they are is what they mean. Data suggests, it's people who conclude. And so with data, it's really important to recognize that it is not an absolute. And this was a problematic assumption. And I'm sure those on the call might hear this and go, yeah, I know that. I bet you do. But the problem is, if everybody in the system doesn't, then the system in itself doesn't. Another problematic assumption, data are someone else's job. If you're not that person on your team who's the data person, quote unquote, you probably know who is, or the data people. And those in our meetings were very quick to point out, I don't do that, so-and-so does that. And so creating an opportunity to recognize and to act upon data in a non-threatening way can really help undermine that problematic assumption. Kind of interrogating what data mean and how in practical, concrete, everyday ways undermines the assumption that they're all objective and true. And then making a specific point about the ways in which we gather and use observational notes, field notes, to draw information about next steps. That's another way to undermine that problematic assumption that data are only numbers. Okay, let's go on to the next one. If we do have quality data, we have this opportunity to accurately evaluate programs and guide implementation, legibly explain that implementation, do rigorous evaluation studies, inform policy decisions, and enable systems improvement. Again, none of that will be strikingly surprising, but it's so important to focus on the many ways in which data are used so that we can focus on the need to have high-quality data. Okay, we can go on. In terms of high-quality data, we landed on a pretty simple, focused group of principles. It's got to be relevant, it's got to be fair, it's got to be valid, and it's got to be reliable. The guide that we're sharing today and excited to share today kind of unpacks each of those and gives some activities and exercises and ways to think about that work that you can implement for yourself and your team, but also that you can disseminate more widely. All right, we can go on. So I mentioned this briefly earlier. We oriented around these three key aspects because they're interrelated and they're critical. You really can't do without any of them, and they all apply at all levels for all individuals. I know I'm making a bold statement, but I really do think that that's absolutely true. And the guide is oriented around that as kind of the three sections. So we kind of go into data and impact, we go into data literacy, and we go into data capacity in various ways to help draw that concept to clarity and to operationalize it through specific examples and specific resources. Okay, we can go on. So the guide addresses data management and reporting systems and structures, ways to take data into practice, and then ways to have practice turn into data and then end up back in the system management and reporting. So one of the things we try to do is kind of cast a circle around data use and separate into the most key component parts that are, again, serving as a floor, the most important information that really everybody has to have a handle on. So let's talk a little bit about data impact. I'm going to pause, take a breath, and just give folks an opportunity. If you've got something to say or share or ask, just go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll make sure to hear from you. And that, applies ongoingly. So seeing none, let's go ahead and move on. Thanks. Okay, so we talked about aspects of data use. Another thing in this guide is it talks about what types of data are we talking about. And beyond the distinction of quantitative and qualitative data, we're talking more about, any of these types could be quantitative or qualitative or both. So thinking about process data, how is it happening? How is it moving along? How is the process of QRIS unfolding and being used? Talking about output data, this is what people do. So this is the doings and the makings. This is at the provider level. Output is providing care. At the technical assistance and coaching level, it's providing advice, reaching out with resources, it's showing up on site, the hours in which that's done, the types of support that are given in those hours, and then also the ratings of programs can be considered an output data. But they verge on an outcome data point. So let's go ahead and talk about outcome data. That's the results of what we did. So if output is what we're doing, outcome is what happened. And making that distinction is critical, and it may not be something surprising to you, but focusing on the different types of data can not only help make it a little bit more accessible, but it can help us think in more nuanced ways. And again, satisfaction data simply is how are providers feeling about the services they receive, how are technical assistants, coaches, and staff feeling about the assistance and training they receive, systems administrators even. These items are really important because they provide kind of a pulse on how people are feeling toward what they're doing and the results that they're seeing. And so this is useful as a list to list these types, not only because we can kind of frame with more nuance what we mean by data, but also you can look for gaps. This can be helpful for gaps analysis. If you were to say what we have, usually people overly focus on outcome data without recognizing that without clear analysis and conclusion about your process data, the process has everything to do with the outcome. The output has everything to do with the outcome. And so you can do a gaps analysis if you look at your overall host of data. If you look at your dashboards, how much of this is process, output, satisfaction, or outcome data that can help you think about where you may have holes in the ways in which you use or share or disseminate data to your folks. Okay, let's cruise. Next slide. Here we go, talking a little bit about another, we talked about types of data, quantitative and qualitative, one way to carve it up. Those 4 types I just shared is one way to carve it up. Another way to carve up the data that we've got are we have some that are about the people involved and some is about the performance. So you think about who's doing what, kind of the central tenets of that is the population is the who, and the doing is the performance. And so those are interesting ways to also do a gaps analysis on the ways that you have or use data. And it can, again, be a useful way to make more legible the overall systems and process of data use with folks who may feel less comfortable with it. All right, let's go on.
Nick, I'm seeing a question in the chat box that is asking, how do you see the relationship of what you're discussing with the notion of logic model development? Do you see it as a parallel process, as similar, or having different endpoints? Talk a little bit about
sure.
that.
Let's back up a couple slides. Let's go to the process output outcome slide. So we'll go to slide 14 if we can. Okay, so logic modeling. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is in a way to think about where are we and where are we going. These are often displayed graphically in terms of creating more simple designs that we can get our heads around. The logic model development is so critical in program design and program evaluation because in a sense it's a sketch of what we're doing, why, and how, and it creates an opportunity to assess or analyze what we have done. I'm going to bring up an example of Rube Goldberg. You may have heard about this before. He's a person who made cartoons where you might have like a bowling ball on a ramp and it goes down the ramp and it hits the teeter-totter and that throws the thing up in the air, right? So it's kind of a comical way to think about logic modeling. But if you were to think about it, one of those cartoons or just think about a logic model you've seen and used, a great way to interrogate your logic model is to go, okay, where are process data gathering points? We're going to go from A to B and get there through process C. How do we gather information about that process? And you can ask yourself, how would we know if we were doing it well? How would we know if we were doing it less well? How would we know if we were doing it fast? How would we know if we were doing it slow? Being able to interrogate the process is important. And in a logic model, if you're starting here and going there, it's almost easy to get caught up in the outcome data. Did it work? Did we get there? without thinking, once people got there, did they like it? Did we get where we're trying to go, but also do we like where we have come? And did we like the process that got us there? Could it be done more efficiently next time? What kinds of efforts are going to be needed by whom? That's output. So yeah, it's similar to logic modeling, except you can make a more interesting and useful logic model. You can edit and improve logic models by interrogating them in terms of what types of data do they rely on, and do they generate, and can be used to improve them. Gail, do you want to say anything else about that? I appreciate that question. So I'd agree that it is similar to logic modeling, but one of the things that this kind of thing can help us do is to interrogate and improve our logic model. All right, we can go ahead to slide 16. Okay, this is a piece of content that comes right out of it. This is, when you read the guide, this is a great exercise called Turning the Curve, and this comes out of a resource that we cite in the book. But it's created to be a print it and use it agenda. I'm sure out of 32 folks on this call, a good handful of you, if not most of you, sometimes have to create an agenda. And if you're anything like me, sometimes you forget to do it until right before it happens. Well, this is an agenda that you could just print and use in that situation, but it can help frame conversations around data at a meeting. Everybody at a meeting who has one of these might take a moment, answer a question. You could go through them one at a time, but this is, again, a simple, user-friendly resource, and that means to us that it has links to stuff you can print and use in your own system and to take and to improve upon. So this is just a showing of one of those resources that's in it. All right, so I talked a little bit about data impact. This resource is about data impact. Let's go right ahead to the next slide, and I'll just be quiet while you read the quote. As something becomes more legible, literacy becomes more accessible and also more critical. And so this is a line that comes out of a QRIS Build report, 3.0 report. And so we orient around this, and we really buy into this idea. And that frames a little bit of the data literacy. And I'll just kind of move on to this concept we introduced in the realm of data literacy around mapping. So here's a couple of different types of maps. Let's go to the next one. So this is a map that is in a way a logic model, as Gail brought up, and this was created by one of our members here, Mary, and she used this as an example and shared something that was a way to initially map it, and what she realized was this was too complex and complicated. And let's go to the next slide. And then this is a little blurry, but this is a way to say she took that one and turned it into this one. And again, we're talking about literacy. And so creating these kinds of images and pictures that are focusing us on what we're trying to do and how are great ways to make data more legible, and in that way increase data literacy. So she's mapping an outcome there through a logic model and kind of an approach. And let's go on to the next one. Here's another couple of types of mapping we'll talk about, and you can see them in the guide. So mapping systems. Right? Making things very clear, and here's where we are, and here's where we're trying to go, and Mary's modeled that. Identifying the important action areas, those were those in her honeycomb-like picture, those items around the edge, and they help us prioritize, what are those action areas, and then to be able to define and describe who's going to do what. And again, that leads from a logic model into a more nuanced perspective that has process and satisfaction data implicated as well. All right, let's go on. And I know I'm just cruising through here, but that's intentional. I want you to really pick this guide up and kind of get deeper into it. So here's a model where something was commonly misunderstood by providers. This was developed by some colleagues at Child Careware in Washington. And this is fantastic. This created a way to say we have these various data registries. How do they interact and relate? We don't want this knowledge to simply live in the minds of the IT or systems administrators. If everybody's interacting with these software systems, if they input data, they got to understand how they're connected and related. Let's go on. So here we've got some mapping of a different type instead of mapping those things or those databases. this is a mapping of the individuals and the types of data feedback loops. I'm not going to describe this because I can't do it justice in a short amount of time, but I want you to really check this out in the resource, because just like interrogating your logic model, if you interrogate your feedback loops, you'll be able to find gaps and then improve your system. Yeah, and as Chris mentioned, you can do that, like I was saying as well, and becoming more clear about where your day-to-day holes might be so that you can address them and improve them. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, so one of the things that we recognized in terms of mapping is that maps can become overly complex, and we had a colleague, Tabitha, who created a really highly complex map. Let's go 2 slides ahead to slide 25 and start there. So this is what she originally showed, and the way she described it, those who looked at it kind of looked on it like it was some type of magic eye picture where nobody really wanted to say, I don't get this. But you can see we have place, we have type of training that's been given, and the percentage of providers who have used it, right? So in that place, how much of what type of training has been done? Well, what she noticed was that the type of training and the amount wasn't corresponding with the type and amount that had been taken up by providers. So she created a map with those 3 variables. And folks just kind of looked at her like, hey, nice picture. But they didn't grasp the meaning about what to do. So let's go back 2 slides now. So what she did is she broke out each of those variables into a separate map and led people through it gradually. Saying, okay, layer 1, we have a high percentage of folks trained and a low percentage of folks trained. Kind of helped us go, yeah, this is where we should be training. Okay, next slide. These bubbles show where are we training? And then further, the next slide shows how much we're training where relative to how much we need. And as soon as they grasped that, it was easy for them to think about the next steps. Okay, so hopefully overall this guide can be something that you read and find useful and can help you think about next steps and the ways in which you want to improve data use across your systems. And it creates an opportunity to start conversations with common terminology. And in a way, this guide is a great answer to the question, what are other states doing? Although it won't tell you state by state who provided these ideas, the process we used to gather this information and put it together was really built around what are people doing that's working and how are they doing it. All right, so at this point, I want to just thank everybody for letting me walk you through that content at kind of a high level. And we're interested to hear from you. Kind of how does that content sit with you? And I have another webinar that I have to jump on, but I really want to thank you again, Debbie, for the opportunity to do this, and Jonathan for helping to run the technicals. And Chris and Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you to facilitate some ongoing discussion and hopefully garner some interest in keeping this community of practice going. Thank you. Go right ahead to the next one.
Thanks, Nick.
Great, and thank you, Nick, and hello again, everybody. This is Chris. So as Nick left us with that final thought, we're going to now turn our conversation into a two-way dialogue. We very much want to hear from you, either through the chat box, as Gail demonstrated for us, or via raising your hand, and then we will call upon you to make a contribution. At this time, kind of our focus is really on reflecting upon very high level of what you've seen within the context of this guide. What further questions does that bring up in terms of application to your own system? I was reflecting as Nick was describing and having been a part of the community on each session's cognitive dissonance that it brought about for me in a positive way, where I would hear an idea from another state or hear a challenge from another state, and I would have to think on what we do in Maryland, some of the other states that I'm a partner with, and how that work might apply, and reconcile that in terms of on a day-to-day operational side, what are we doing with our data? Are we collecting data for data's sake, which I'm sure some of us could be bold enough to acknowledge among friends here, that there are times that we collect data and we don't really have a purpose for it. And are we really getting the most out of all the information that we collect, both in terms of a continuous quality improvement model, in terms of communicating to our stakeholders, in terms of ultimately using that to achieve what I think is our shared vision of powerful early learning systems. So those were, kind of reflections I had just as we went through the process, and as you will find when you take a look at the actual guide are some of the fodder that we include to help you react and reflect upon. So if anybody has questions.
Chris, this is
yes.
Deb. I was thinking about, could you use the guide to orient new staff and develop a vocabulary within the team as you move forward and do work in data, within the QRIS or the technical assistance cadre or whatever nook you're working in? Did you see applicability in it for that type of a purpose?
It's a great question, Deb, and actually gets us to our second point. Yes. The short answer is yes. We saw this and discussed at length ways that you could bring everyone into a common vocabulary. As both Mary and I shared, we see the data story behind this, and as Nick pointed out, that many times our child care workforce do not necessarily have formal data analysis education, but the guide can help both you as a system leader to think through what are the points of information that need to be considered and communicated, but then more importantly to the previous question that Galen brought up is how do you put in processes to both onboard staff or to ensure that at your system level you have folks kind of with their finger on the pulse. Those were some of the reflections that we had as we were developing this, but for others in the community online right now, if anybody either from our community of practice sessions or folks who are just joining us now, if you'd like to either ask additional questions of how you could use it or make your own suggestions, we'd love to hear from you now in the chat pod or by raising your hand. While we're waiting to see if any of those come in, I would add to your question, Deb, that personally I'm a big proponent of going into competency-based workforce development and having our workforce both trained in how they are using data as part of their daily practice and really making the connection and taking away the fear factor, frankly, that data is really about your day-to-day practice, I think is an important need within our field, and this guide can be, and we would hope that you would find it to be a valuable resource in kind of filling in those buckets.
Chris, what you're saying, and something Mary alluded to before, we say to directors at the program level to look at your child assessment data or at your other types of data to sources of evidence to create your continuous quality improvement plan and drive the professional development for the staff. But you're making a great point about have we taught them how to look at the data, how to see the story it's trying to tell us, and then to move then to what do we do next kind of thinking. We assume people can do this, and and yet when I look across the professional development opportunities, there isn't a lot about how to analyze the data at the program level and see how it's informing, or at the implementing partner level, how are implementing partners evaluating their data, to see how can we provide more meaningful technical assistance, or, line up the technical assistance with our priorities, and then there's also at the state level. So really, at every level, I could see the user guide being helpful. And we have a comment in the box that they're currently evaluating current and potential performance indicators. The statewide, they're talking about this level thing, and I can see the guide being very useful for helping supervisors and managers have a common understanding of process and data components. Definitely true.
Absolutely, and thank you, Gail, again for your contribution there. Because to your point, Debbie, what if we were to align all of our systems where, as one of our measures within our QRIS, we are looking at the efficacy of our workforce and being able to translate the day-to-day practice data into action of programming, and we quantify that into a quality measure, and we tie in things like our workforce registries to know where we have strength or gaps in our training skills. That's where that's the type of thinking, and frankly the types of support we want to see result from this community of practice in an ongoing way, very organically contributed and developed by the community at large. So looking for people like Gail and others around the country to help bring forth those great things that you're doing, and to give guidance on what we can produce as a community of practice. So to that end, my last question before we kind of move to our other reflection points would be, beyond the guide, do the audience joining us today, do you have ideas of other products, other tangible things that would help you, help your providers, help your stakeholders be better practitioners of data?
This is Mary, and I just want to say one of the products to come out of here is, I think, for us all to become better communicators, we who bridge between the program and the data side, that's a really excellent outcome of participating in this, and being able to better share data conclusions, similar to what we just saw on the maps that Nick was showing us, how those maps were a very complex approach, and then with experience, the person presenting the maps learned to present them in a much more simplified way, and started to kind of scaffold the information through a series of slides so people understood better. That, just learning those approaches for me, it is a really invaluable tool and skill. So I want to say becoming better communicators through this process will be a really excellent outcome.
Thanks, Mary, and that's actually a great segue as folks are continuing to hopefully think about other products that they would like to see, and you can add those into the chat pod at any time or raise your hand. But these themes for our ongoing community of practice are topics and interest areas that were generated in multiple ways, both from feedback solicited at last year's Build conference and what audience members contributed in their forms, as well as topics that were generated through last year's community and areas that either were identified for going deeper or were topics that we had yet to explore.
And this is Mary. I want to comment on just that first one, that using the data at all levels. one of the biggest challenges in this work was when you get with groups of people around data, you often have people who are at different levels of the organization, and you always want to be really clear about which altitude are we talking about or which data level. I've seen data conversations go south really fast because it's all very interrelated, and it's a skill to keep a group kind of on track as to which level you're talking about. Because you could, in that example, child assessment, or, child data is nested within classroom activities. Classrooms are nested within a site that can create site-level data, and then sites are, managed by agencies. So anyway, that's just a really important skill, and I worked under a great director recently who always used that word altitude and just said, okay, we're at this high altitude. Okay, now we're down at the frontline altitude. And just a couple more comments about these themes. This is a slide I kind of asked to pop in here somewhat late in the game, so it doesn't have the same design as the other ones. But we saw in these themes that people are looking for QRIS quality monitoring metrics. And to your point, Chris, about sometimes we can collect data for data's sake, and oftentimes as you evolve in data work, you realize there are a few really salient metrics that can really give you very good monitoring information, and maybe you no longer need to collect as much detail as you once did. Excuse me. But figuring out what the salient metrics are sometimes happens over time. And as
your good point about revisiting, what do we have the right elements? Are the data points still germane? And almost to sift through, at what point do you sift through and take some away for the burden, what I mean, of collecting? Or, I think that's something that we forget about is, we're in a collect more and more data world, and at what point do you say something like, let's, step back a little bit here and collect a little less, or this data isn't helping us answer our questions or understand our system or something like that.
When I worked in South Carolina for First Step, we created a dashboard and pulled salient metrics more for the executive director level to have a quick snapshot of important things happening in programs, and I think it was a really popular report because it was a quick one, and you could see important features. When you get into data for workforce and professional development, my goodness, there's a lot in that field, and that's only going to, I think, become an even richer area. The workforce data in QRIS scoring, of course, it factors heavily into quality scores. Data used for policy changes, big topic. And then we've talked today about telling your QRIS story with data, but that's different than telling your QRIS data story. Telling your QRIS data story might involve how you, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, how you got from point A to point B in data collection. But that's different than taking data and really laying out a good story and a good narrative illustrated by data points.
Mary, Chris again, and I just wanted to chime in with that and hopefully give you a chance to grab a sip of water.
Thanks.
So in Maryland, we were fortunate that we had really significant growth with our QRIS, and I think this kind of illustrates your point. And again, this is one of those concepts that we also try to give some thinking around within the guide, that our QRIS data story was that we went from 77 programs under tiered reimbursement to over 5,600 programs with what became our current QRIS Maryland Excels, and we implemented a number of changes, including a data system and better processes and things of that nature. So that was our QRIS data story, but then our QRIS story with data is slightly different because within that growth we have a number of programs that are what we call non-participants or inactive, and we have programs that are confined to a lower level of quality. And so making sure that both you as leaders and our constituents are aware of how to have those conversations around data and how to appropriately understand and interpret the data to know where your target areas are is critical. And that was a recurring theme during our previous year's worth of community practice conversations that we hopefully have captured in a way that's useful to think about that within the guide.
Mm. And I think moving ahead, I think we want to use the rest of our time to really ask about the community practice and what thoughts people might have about the coming year in the community practice on data, especially on QRIS data. And we would love for you to give us an input into the chat box or please speak up, because we would really like to know, in addition to the topics that I just listed, what your thoughts are about what you all would like to get from the experience, or what could we offer that would improve your work. They also want to ask.
Mary,
yeah,
just let's ask a verifying question here. So
yes.
your group is going to move forward with another year of the data community of practice. And so the question to the people on the line are, is there someone in your organization, or would you be interested? And if you're thinking about someone on your team becoming involved in the data community of practice, then, you know, how would you weigh in on these format questions, or what you'd like someone to, you know, what you'd like the tenor of their experience to be, or yours? And I'm seeing already a couple of people jumping into the chat box saying that they would like to be involved and get the information about your ongoing community. So I guess I would suggest that. Type in if you would like us to contact you about it, even to get to someone else on your team. And if you have ideas about the questions that Mary's posing here about what would your state or regional area want to gain from the experience, how could being involved in learning with, you know, other states help improve the use of data and the collection of data and your data capacity in the state.
And possibly we'd want to segment the sessions on a common topic and invite people to hold forth on the topic regarding their experiences and their challenges and share solutions.
You know, we have a great and Lillian, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, unmute yourself and just speak up, but we do have some people in the chat box saying they want to read the guide and then they'll give us feedback, and then but others saying also that they want to be in the community. So I'd like to say, please reach out to me after you have a look at the guide with suggestions or feedback about it. My email, I think everybody pretty much has by now, but it's, let me just move forward to the last slide. It's right here, dmathias@Build Initiative, and you know, we'll definitely be interested in feedback about the guide, and if you have someone on your team, you can have them email me in terms of I'll get them hooked up with Nick and Chris and Mary and others. Really, you have a great leadership group in this community of practice. And it was exciting because it was born from the QRIS meeting session in 2016, and they did the community of practice for a whole year and wrote this guide, you know, and presented at the next year's conference. So it was really quite a labor of love, people, passionate about the work and, really thinking so super intentionally about how to get better at working in the field in this area. And I just appreciate all the work that, your group has done in the past year and thoughtful thinking and deliberating and sharing. It's just been really terrific. Chris and Mary, we're about ready to wrap up time-wise. Is there anything else that you'd like to punctuate here for us or end with, a thought to end with?
Go ahead, Mary.
I'll just say it really has been an excellent experience for me personally to participate in this. Like I mentioned before, I've built my skills, learned to be a better data storyteller, learned so much from colleagues, and we have had a lot of wide open topics, and yet we've always, in every single session, I think we've always shared something with one another that's been a real gem. And now I have colleagues that I call and can get additional information offline. So it's great. I'm glad we're continuing, and I thank you. And thank you, Deb, and thank Build and your supporters for the opportunity.
And I would absolutely echo that, and Deb and Build, but a lot of you, Deb, you kind of took this idea and let us run with it, and that's fantastic and a real testament to the kind of leader you are, but the type of organization that Build is, and so we are very grateful for that. I would also say this for the group. One, we absolutely want the feedback on the guide, and it'll be a continuous quality improvement exercise itself. But the guide is just one manifestation of the power of this group, and it really needs you or your colleagues to be members so we can build more resources together. Some of you know my shtick about I'm a big proponent of system-level shared services. When we work together, we are better. We are able to make better outcomes for kids. We're able to make better, more sustainable systems. And so to me, this is just another example of that, and I would really invite all of you to sign up and be a part of this. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for sharing your time and your project, and we all can't wait until Jonathan sends around the notice of this meeting and we can all get our hands on the guide, even though I've been reading it myself over the last couple of weeks. But I'm really looking forward to it, and thank you again for your time today, and thanks to everyone who was on the call and for your comments and engagement. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.